We are talking about how to build a project plan that doesn't fall apart. The plan is one of the most important deliverables on an entire project. And as you can see, we have it over on the pedestal on the right because it aligns everyone on what is the work. And what does done mean? When do we finish the project? It turns the ambiguity into clarity because it provides the structure of what is the work, but it also exposes risks and dependencies and unrealistic expectations. So it helps to actually set expectations with leadership and stakeholders in terms of what is the work, when is the work going to be done by. It creates accountability by documenting who owns the work, and it reduces rework because it focuses on sequencing the work. There's time spent to make sure that the work is in the right sequence, and it serves as the single source of truth for the project. It also allows the PMs to baseline the work, to sort of manage the progress, forecast, and so on. So today I'm going to talk about a 7-step method to coming up with a plan that doesn't crumble, and I'm going to give you a whole bunch of tips based on my experience at the end, and hopefully you'll find this useful. So why do plans fall apart? Probably makes sense to start there. It's because stakeholders don't agree on what's being delivered. The plan is too high level or it's too complicated. So if it's too high level, it doesn't have enough details, so it's not realistic. And if it's too complicated, you can't track it and follow it. Assumptions are wrong or not documented. It's so important to write down your assumptions early on because I promise you're going to forget why certain things are done certain ways in the plan. Without documenting them, you're going to forget the reasoning behind it. Not having ownership for tasks and deliverables means we don't know who's working on it, and which likely means no one's working on it, and then the probability of delivering is pretty low. Dependencies are not identified early enough, and work is so complicated these days that almost every project has interdependencies with other areas. And if the planning is done in isolation, as I mentioned, the work is so complicated that it requires the input from lots of different stakeholders and team members. And so building a plan off on the side without engaging them is just asking for failure. Or the plan is created once and not updated. If it's not maintained, then there's really no use in it, and it really is the primary tool. If PMs were carpenters, I mean, this would be our hammer. So it really is the primary tool that we use. So let's talk about the approach in the 7-step method that I mentioned. And first is defining the outcomes of what do we expect the project to do. We have to start here so that we have a sense of what we're trying to accomplish. Then there's building a work breakdown structure, which is decomposing down the scope into logical buckets. There's sequencing that work. There's building out the schedule of when the work is going to happen, assigning who's going to be the owners, and just look at how happy these people are to be owners of tasks on projects. Then there's validating the plan with the key stakeholders, as well as managing the plan. So relatively high level, and we're going to go into each of these steps, and I'll identify some tips and tricks as we go along. So first, we're going to define the outcomes, and that means starting with the end state, not just the work. So again, what are we trying to accomplish? Before we get into how do we do it or what are the activities and so on, what are we trying to accomplish with this project? Or in other words, how do we know the project is successful? And there's ways of documenting smart outcomes and so on, and I think you've all heard of that. You want to make sure that you capture it in plain language so that it's understood by all. And all projects have a sponsor, so you want to make sure that your sponsor is the one giving you that vision and is in agreement with the outcomes, because ultimately they're the ones signing off on the measures of success. And you want to document certain constraints. In some cases, there might be a project that has a time constraint. We have to deliver this by December 30th. And maybe you have flexibility in other areas, but it's important to document those items. And pro tip, once you identify those outcomes, you want to organize all of your reporting in the context of those outcomes so that you're not just reporting on, hey, we had a meeting or we did this activity, is everything that you're doing is aligned to a particular objective or a particular outcome. So next, we build that work breakdown structure, which means breaking the work down into logical chunks, or said differently, moving from sort of the high level phases to the more detailed work package. So if the overall objective is build a sandwich, maybe you break that down into, get the bread and put the things on the bread and, cut the bread, and then you decompose them even further. You don't want to worry about dates yet. This is really about the structure of the project. But you want to make sure that each work package is a tangible outcome. And as I mentioned before, you want to validate that with the team that's actually doing the work and making sure there's nothing missing or assumptions or overlaps. You want to keep it detailed enough so that you have a lot of the details and you can manage it, but not overwhelming. And as I mentioned, the pro tip is you want to use as many tools as you have possible and as many resources. So that's the team and the experts who know what they're doing, as well as any historical information. So maybe somebody else made a sandwich before and they have an existing plan or WBS that you can leverage. So we've identified our objectives, we've built the work breakdown structure, and now we need to sequence the work, which is essentially putting the tasks in the order that they happen. And a lot of times there's dependencies between the work. So one activity can't start until the other one does. So you can't slice the sandwich until you've put it together, as an example. And it's important to understand the tasks that are the long poles in the tent, those things that take the longest amount of time, because generally those are the ones that have the biggest risk of impacting your ultimate schedule. There's deliverables that require a lot of different team members, and you want to call those out because those are the interdependencies that you need to manage along the project. I like using a simple visual flow or PowerPoint or sticky notes, just to sort of, again, inventory all the things that need to happen. You're validating that with your subject matter experts and flagging high risk dependencies. And there's also something called the critical path on projects, which is literally the most critical path that your project takes to get to the end. And this is important to manage because sometimes there's other tasks that maybe if you slip or they're not done perfectly, it doesn't sort of destroy the whole project. And therefore the critical path ones are those activities that are the ones that really drive the end result. So now we're building a realistic schedule. We've identified the work. Working with the team members, you're identifying how long something's going to take. So it takes me, 5 minutes to spread the peanut butter on the sandwich. You're considering all the different times and approvals. So, maybe my wife has to tell me if I put enough jelly on the sandwich and I get approval before I can slice it in half. You want to avoid assuming full-time allocation. So most people on projects have 10 other jobs to do. So when you build the schedule, you have to consider how long it takes somebody to do something. So if it's a 40-hour activity, and by the way, this is the difference between effort and duration. So if the effort is 40 hours, but somebody's only working a quarter of their time, so 10 hours a week on the project, that's a 4-week activity for them. So you really have to take into account people's allocations. And then you got to think about vacations and holidays and things like that so that you're not scheduling over them. We talked about the critical path. We've talked about validating a couple times. I am a big fan of schedule contingency. That is putting contingency in my schedule. So if my work tells me that I'm going to be done Thanksgiving, maybe I schedule it to the first or second week in December because I know there's going to be problems and things are going to slip. And I know you're going to say that a lot of times we're just given dates and we don't have the ability to do that. And I get that, but where possible, you want to add schedule contingency because I promise things are going to come up. And it's really hard to find time. Generally, you can find money and sometimes you could find resources, but you can't really find time on projects. And so schedule contingency is one of my favorite tools. And by the way, you don't tell anybody about it. You just put it in the plan and you keep it as sort of your secret stash of time. So now that we've laid out the work, you got to identify, the happy owners there, is to each one owns it. And every task should have one person, not a committee, not multiple names, one person that's responsible for completing the work. Obviously, you got to make sure that those people are available. Building out roles and responsibilities is important, but making sure that they understand the expectations and deliverables, which kind of gets to my pro tip of just putting their name on the plan doesn't mean that they know that they're accountable. So you have to let them know. And whether that's reviewing the plan or confirming with them, it's really important because if you're going to hold them accountable, you have to set the expectations and they have to be aware of it and then communicating those expectations. So now we've built out the schedule, we've assigned owners, and now we need to validate it, make sure that everything's good. So we're going to present it all together to our leads, to our experts, make sure that everybody's in agreement because, by the way, you really want buy-in to the plan. If you're going to hold team members accountable for the dates that they came up with, then they need to be part of the plan because I've been on too many projects where we tell people the dates and then nobody feels like they have any buy-in because they were just told the dates and they didn't think it was realistic to begin with, and therefore, if we miss it, it's so what? right? So it's important to review that with people, understand the critical path, risks, assumptions, things like that. You may even want to sort of document an email approval. So I keep those emails off because I will tell you, I've had times where I've had to go back and revisit them to say, hey, look, this is what we agreed upon. That's fine if you want to change it, but this is what we agreed upon. So having that written history is important as well. And then finally, it's managing the plan. So once you've created it, it's not a one-time activity. You don't just sort of put it down. It's updated regularly. I mean, possibly even daily. I mean, again, this is our hammer. So we have to have it with us at all times. We have to maintain it as things complete. We mark them done. As things change, we mark them up. We manage progress against things. We adjust it for risks. We rebaseline as needed. So this is our best friend that we carry around everywhere, and it's the source of truth for our meetings. So, a few tips for having the plan that doesn't fall apart that we've talked about today is not planning alone, is leveraging the team, A, because they have the experience, and B, to leverage their buy-in for when the plan actually happens. You want to write down those assumptions as much as possible because you will forget them, and it's important to recognize the thought process when they came up with them. Risks are important to be visible so you don't have any fires later. We talked about dependencies. You got to figure out how to manage them, keep them front and center, and recognize when you're dependent on other areas, especially if they're projects or organizations outside your project, because a lot of times that requires a lot of coordination. Review your plan weekly, at least, maybe daily. It's a living process. You want to communicate things as they happen. We've talked about the milestones and the critical path. And look, you want to put your plan on the pedestal. It's your most important tool, and you want to treat it as such. So let me know what you think about this, if I've missed anything, or if it's sort of what you would expect in terms of laying out the project plan. But hopefully it doesn't fall apart, and thanks for watching. Okay, this one's going to be a fun one. On projects, there's always challenges, there's always problems, and that always requires escalation. But what you don't want to do is be the workplace Karen, where you're just screaming that you want to speak to the manager. And so escalation doesn't mean conflict, it means visibility. So today we're going to talk about how to escalate calmly, clearly, and professionally with proven PM techniques to get the decisions fast without blowing things up, because you don't want to be a viral video where you speak to the manager and you could see over here this Karen got a 2 million views. And so you definitely don't want to be that person that everybody talks about, that goes viral for all the wrong reasons. But why does escalation matter? Well, it keeps leadership aware of risks before they explode. So it's sort of a proactive transparency. In some cases, maybe you're just escalating in terms of, hey, it's a risk. You don't need to do anything yet. And with leaders, you have to be explicit. I'm just making you aware. You don't have to do anything yet. And so now you're just sort of giving them that heads up, or protecting the team from unrealistic demands. You're ensuring that decisions happen at the right level of authority. And so sometimes there needs to be a decision to move something forward, a key solution, a sign off, whatnot. And it requires following up with a senior person and escalating. More times than not, escalations are about risks or issues that are sort of stalling the project or killing the schedule and requires something to be removed. And whether it's your executive talking to another executive, or you're escalating to a vendor that's not getting something done, this is probably the most common way that I see escalations. And you want it to create transparency. It's not really about finger pointing, and it's about giving the PMs the backup when those things require senior support. And all of it, the intention is to protect momentum and predictability. So you're only really escalating because something is risking your project to being delivered, and your job is to make sure that you're delivering it, and you need someone's help. Now, there's ways that it goes wrong, right? So it could trigger the drama and the Karen video for a few reasons. If you escalate too early, then you're sort of the what is it, the chicken with the sky falling, that or that you're sort of crying wolf. That's it, crying wolf. Um, and then when there's a real problem, you've lost credibility, right? You don't have context. You definitely do not want to frame escalation as blame or complaint, because then that kind of makes you look bad, and it takes the focus away from the work that needs to be done, and it looks like you're just sort of pointing at somebody else. Surprising stakeholders. So the exact opposite of escalating too early is if you surprise them with last minute alarms, and all of a sudden, the first thing they're going to say is, well, how come you didn't tell me about this before? You don't want to be emotional or unclear. The messages have to be clear and succinct. You don't want to escalate to the wrong audience. So if you don't want to go 7 levels up if it doesn't need to be, or conversely, if it's a really big issue, you don't want to do sort of a junior manager. You definitely don't want to escalate to vent, and you don't want to show up and just say, "Here's a problem," and dump it on the executive without coming with recommendations. So the first thing I would say is try to resolve it first. And this sounds obvious, and most of the times when there's an escalation, this has already been attempted. But it starts with saying, is it really an issue that requires escalation? And having a direct conversation. I remember there was one time there was a team that didn't want to get something done, and I said, look, he's like, well, you're gonna have to call my manager. I said, here's what's gonna happen. I'm gonna call my manager. They're gonna call their VP. The VP is gonna call your VP. Then they're gonna call your manager, and then they're gonna tell you to do it. So instead of, can't we just skip all those steps and then you just do it, right? And this was somebody I had a good relationship with, so I don't recommend negotiating this way. And we just sort of agreed that we would take care of it. So having a direct conversation does help sometimes, clarifying expectations or misunderstandings. So maybe somebody didn't do something because they weren't aware, or there was some other crisis that came up. And then you got to look what is actually blocking the progress, and look for attempts to resolve it. And so that's where you give somebody a chance. Now, if then you've done that and you've given them the chance, and you seek to understand, and it still is a challenge, then because our jobs are to make things move forward, then we have to escalate. And in that case, you want to gather the facts as much as possible. So what happened? What's the actual impact? What are the risks to our scope or our schedule or some of our deliverables? When did it start? How long? What have we tried, and what options exist to solve the problem? Which then gets to what support is needed from leadership. And you want to stay away from emotions or finger pointing or anything like that. You really just want to focus on, here is the challenge, here's what happened, here's the impact of what happened, here's the escalation that's needed, and here's what happens if we don't fix the escalation, right? And so telling them sort of the impact of not making the decision matters as well. And you want to craft a clear and calm message. What's the punchline? What is the decision needed? Brief context. Do not write an entire essay of the entire history that brought you up to this. I promise you they're not going to want to read it, and you're going to lose credibility. I talked about talking about the impact. You want it to be professional without blame, and come up with a few recommendations. Hey, here's what the team said. And by the way, here's what we need from you. So being explicit with the ask. And then offering to schedule a meeting and say, hey, if you want details, or let me know, putting time on the calendar, again, depending on the level and the culture of your organization, rather than putting things in an email. And this may be better as a conversation. And then it's about choosing the right audience and channel. So who's the right person to escalate to? You don't want to skip 3 levels without going through the proper channels. A lot of organizational culture sort of frowns on that, and that's viewed as a bad thing. And what's the right medium? Is it email? Is it a meeting? If it's sensitive, maybe it's a private escalation first, or a phone call, right? Nobody does those things anymore, but giving someone a phone call. You don't want to carbon copy the world on emails if it is an email, because you don't want this to get passed around and so on. Which, by the way, is another lesson learned, is when you're writing it, write it as if somebody's going to get passed around and somebody else is going to read it, because that's probably what's going to happen. And so you don't want to, another reason why you don't want to blame anybody on an email. And you definitely want to document these escalated items in your RAID log, because most likely if you've escalated it, then it's a risk or an issue. And then you want to deliver it with confidence. You want to stay calm. You set the tone. You stick to the facts and the data and the outcomes. Focus on the solution. You recognize that the efforts that are already made, and but you say, look, I'm trying to solve it, not to blame it. And you ask for the support. Here is what we need from you. Um, and more times than not, that's received well, and you get what you need done. And I recognize there's organizational politics and all sorts of nonsense that you can't really account for, but generally staying calm and focusing on the facts works. And then you want to follow up, document the decision with the justification and the facts, communicate it, update the RAID log if needed. What are the next steps? Thank them, obviously, show gratitude, and monitor to make sure it's actually resolved, and then close it out. So a few practical tips that we've talked about. You want to escalate early enough to prevent a disaster, not when it's too late, right? Our job as PMs is to drive things forward and to bring transparency and to remove obstacles. And escalation is one way to remove obstacles. But you want to come with solutions, not just here's my problem, you solve it. You want to be very conscious of your language, focus on we and not they and not blaming. You don't want to threaten escalation uh, as a means to get something done. You don't want it to be emotional or dramatic, and you want to give your manager a heads up, especially if you're going to go up to pretty senior. And then look, now you're making a video and you're much more happy, and you see who's filming it, and you don't wind up on YouTube. So speaking of YouTube, I hope you are enjoying my channel and my videos. And if you need to escalate some of my videos, just let me know. Thanks.